Here he comes.
Here comes the general.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Here comes the general.
the moment you've been waiting for.
Here comes the general.
The pride of Mount Vernon.
Here comes the general.
George Washington.
George Washington was the first president of the United States, serving from 1789 to 1797. However, before he was president, he was the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army during the American Revolutionary War. The Revolutionary War was fought from 1775 to 1783. The British government had rule over the 13 colonies and wanted to make as much money off of them as possible. The British had the power to enact various laws in Parliament outside of America which significantly affected life and trade in the 13 colonies. The Acts of Parliament benefited the British, but not the colonies, and the Americans were not given the same rights as the British people, nor did they have any representatives in the British Parliament to present their points of view. The colonists protested against things like the Sugar Act, Stamp Act, and Tea Act.
Debate with me? Why should a tiny island across the sea regulate the price of tea?
In 1775 through 1776, a pamphlet called Common Sense was written by Thomas Paine.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
It advocated for independence from Great Britain to people in the 13 colonies. On July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence,
Which I wrote.
was a statement adopted in the Second Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This statement announced that the 13 American colonies regarded themselves as 13 newly independent sovereign states and no longer under British rule. The Articles of Confederation served as the written document that established the function of the national government of the United States after it declared independence from Great Britain. The Articles of Confederation were enforced from March 1st, 1781 until March 4th, 1789, when the present Constitution went into effect. The Bill of Rights,
Which I wrote.
is the collective name for the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution. The Bill of Rights amendments adds to the Constitution specific guarantees of personal freedoms and rights, clear limitations on government's power in judicial and other proceedings, and explicit declarations that all powers not specifically delegated to Congress by the Constitution are reserved for the states or the people. George Washington had been acting president from the point of independence until the end of his second term when he decided to retire back to his home in Virginia. The first draft of Washington's farewell address was originally prepared in 1792 with the assistance of James Madison as Washington prepared to retire following a single term in office. However, he set aside the letter and ran for a second term after the hostility between his Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, and his Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, convinced him that the growing division between newly formed Federalist and Republican parties, along with the current state of foreign affairs, would rip the country apart in his absence of leadership. 4 years later, as his second term came to a close, Washington revisited the letter and, with the help of Alexander Hamilton, prepared a revision of the original draft to announce his intention to decline a third term in office.
The benign influence of good laws of a free government, the ever-favorite object of my heart.
Interchangeable parts are parts that are identical. They are made so that they will fit into any assembly of the same type. One such part can freely replace another without any custom fitting. They became crucial to the assembly line in the early 20th century. Eli Whitney developed interchangeable parts for firearms of the military, but they eventually became used in many industries such as sewing machines, reapers, and steam engines. An urban entrepreneur is a person who organizes, manages, and takes on the risks of a business. There were many powerful men during the industrial era whose businesses created jobs for factory workers in cities. This created the urban working class and allowed the United States economy to expand greatly. Some of these men were Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, and John D. Rockefeller. Andrew Carnegie was known as the Steel King. He streamlined every phase of his operation, which became known as vertical integration. His goal was to improve efficiency by making the supply chain more reliable. He did this through eliminating the middleman. J.P. Morgan was a banker who financed the reorganization of railroads, insurance companies, and banks. He bought out Carnegie, and in 1901, he started the United States Steel Corporation. John D. Rockefeller organized the Standard Oil Company. By 1877, he controlled 95% of all of the refineries in the United States. He also organized the trust fund system and started the process known as horizontal integration. Another factor that led to the growing industrial economy and expanding America was steam engines and railroads. Railroads were the most important development during this time because they allowed for quick transportation of raw materials, goods, and later, people. The Louisiana Purchase was the U.S. acquisition of the Louisiana Territory from France in 1803 for $15 million. The purchase secured American control of the Mississippi River and doubled the size of the nation. The purchase showed the American people, especially the farmers who lived in the West, that the government cared about them and would work to meet their needs. This helped Western farmers remain loyal to the country. Thomas Jefferson hesitated to make the Louisiana Purchase because the Constitution said nothing about buying land. This showed Americans that a loose view of the Constitution was needed.
In the election of 1912, Woodrow Wilson won the election because Taft and Roosevelt split the Republican ticket. Wilson wanted to improve the banking system, lower tariffs, and, by breaking up monopolies, give small businesses freedom to compete. Wilson was president since the start of World War I in 1914. However, U.S. did not declare war on Germany until 1912 in response to the Zimmerman Note. 1 year later, World War I ended with the Treaty of Versailles. It was a compromise that ended land and freedom disputes. It was not passed until Germany took full blame for the war. A few years after the Treaty of Versailles was signed, League of Nations was formed. It was a world organization that promoted international cooperation for peace. It was first proposed by Wilson. However, the United States never joined League of Nations. It was essentially powerless and dissolved in 1946 after the end of the Second World War. A few presidents later, Franklin Roosevelt won the election in 1932. His plan was called the New Deal. The three goals of FDR's New Deal were relief, recovery, and reform. Roosevelt passed many reforms and laws that were substantial to his New Deal. The Civil Works Administration put more than 4 million people to work during the winter. The Federal Housing Authority expanded private home ownership among moderate-income families through federal guarantees of private mortgages, the reduction of down payments from 30% to 10%, and the extension of repayment from 20 to 30 years. It continues to function today. FDR was also president during the Great Depression. Though the relief and reform measures put into place by Roosevelt helped lessen the effects of the Great Depression in the 1930s, the economy would not fully turn around until after 1939, when World War II kicked American industry into high gear.
In 1939, World War II started when Germany invaded Poland under the command of Hitler, who rose to power promising perseverance to a hopeless and failing Germany. To Americans, communism, Germany, and all its allies like Japan and Russia were seen as the enemy. America joined the war when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941. While troops were at war, the home front war effort was hard at work. The war finally ended in 1945 when Allies defeated German forces and the United States dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war changed America's mindset completely from depression to complete prosperity. This started a whole new culture in the nation. The culture started an era of suburbanization. With the desperate need for peace, normalcy, and the idea of a prosperous future came the baby boom. Between 1946 and 1964, the birth rate of Americans skyrocketed thanks to factors like the GI Bill, which gave financial aid to veterans for college tuition, mortgages, and more. Other factors included ads and general social pressure that urged women to leave work and return home, with books and magazine titles such as Femininity Begins at Home and Cooking to Me is Poetry. From this pressure creating a nuclear family in the suburbs, a counterculture was born. This counterculture opposed all social norms, moving away from suburbs and sometimes even forming communes. As Vietnam started, the counterculture immediately opposed. By the mid to late 60s, counterculture hippies were rioting and picketing in protest to the war. Soon, these hippies became synonymous with peace and opposition of the war, along with women's rights, free sexuality, and drug experimentation. As the anti-war protest became more popular, others spoke out about civil rights and oppression. The women's rights movement began, and Martin Luther King Jr. was leading the movement for racial equality. These movements were often expressed through nonviolent civil disobedience, like rioting, picketing, or passive resistance. After a tough road with still many obstacles to face, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was enacted on July 2, 1964, which outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Finally, the Vietnam War ended in 1975, when Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, was captured by the People's Army of Vietnam and the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, and U.S. troops were sent home.
Ronald Reagan was the 40th President of the United States. He was raised in Illinois, but then moved to Hollywood and worked as a radio announcer, but then starred in a few major movies. He became president of the Screen Actors Guild, where he worked to root out the communist influence. He became president and created a new economic plan called Reaganomics. This advocated tax rate reduction, control of the money supply, economic deregulation, and reduction in government spending. His second term involved mostly foreign affairs, things such as ending the Cold War, the bombing of Libya, and the Iran-Contra affair. His famous speech at the Brandenburg Gate challenged Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down this wall. Gorbachev is a Soviet statesman whose foreign policy brought an end to the Cold War, and his domestic policy introduced major reforms. His actions inadvertently set the stage for the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. On September 11, 2001, people associated with the extremist group Al-Qaeda hijacked airlines from the United States and a terrorist attack took place. 2 of the planes flew into the towers of the World Trade Center in New York City. 1 plane hit the Pentagon, and another crashed in a field in Pennsylvania. The attacks resulted in death and destruction, which triggered major U.S. initiatives to stop terrorism. The U.S. took action overseas and eventually killed Al-Qaeda's leader, Osama bin Laden, in Pakistan in 2011.